Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my Endless Diary Tales channel? Thank you so much. I didn't think he'd actually do it. Not really. Sure, Ryan and I had fought before. What couple hasn't? Especially when you're halfway across the world under a hot sun. Too many days into a trip with people you don't really know. His college friends had taken over every meal, every moment, every decision. I was an accessory, invited at the last minute like a plus one. No one expected me to actually show up. It started at lunch, a long wine-soaked affair where everyone laughed too loudly, and I sat there quietly counting how many glasses Ryan had already had. I leaned over and gently said, "Maybe slow down a bit." He didn't like that. "You're always controlling everything," he snapped under his breath, just loud enough for Pete to smirk and raise his glass in mock solidarity. Another round was ordered. Another joke was made at my expense. So I stood up, my voice steady, my hands calm. "I'm going back to the hotel." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just walked outside. I thought he'd follow, apologize maybe, or at least act like he cared. He did follow, but not to say sorry. Outside, the air was drier than I'd expected. Harsh. My sandals clicked softly against the cobblestones as we argued quietly. Then not so quietly. Years of small resentments rose to the surface. Things we'd both buried. My career, his dismissiveness, my nagging as he called it, his drinking, my silence. And then mid-argument he paused and turned to me. "Your passport's in your bag, right?" he asked. "What?" He motioned lazily at my crossbody purse. "You always carry it. You're so prepared." I nodded, still confused. "Yeah, but then you'll figure it out," he said, taking a step back. "You're good at that." Then he turned and walked toward the rental car. "Ryan," I called, not quite believing what I was seeing. He didn't answer. He slid into the driver's seat. Pete was already in the passenger side, the others in the back. I stood there stunned, my mouth still open mid-sentence. Let's see how she gets back. Someone left. The door slammed. The engine started. And then they were gone. The car turned down the narrow street, its taillights glowing briefly before disappearing around a bend. A burst of dust lingered in the air. Then silence. I stood there frozen, completely still. The world continued around me. Tourists passed by, taking photos and sipping espresso. Locals chatted in fast, melodic Spanish. A waiter nearby delivered plates to a table of laughing women. Life continued, but mine had just paused. He wasn't serious, I thought. This is a joke, a scare. He'll be back in 5 minutes tops, 10 maybe. Long enough to make a point. Long enough to punish me for embarrassing him. But he'd come back. He had to. I reached for my phone and called him straight to voicemail again and again. I texted, "Ryan, where are you?" No response. I tried Pete, blocked. Marcus, blocked. Every name I could think of from that lunch table, gone. I wasn't just being ignored. I had been erased. That's when the panic crept in. Not all at once. It started slowly, like a thread unraveling. My stomach twisted. My hands began to shake. The street around me blurred slightly at the edges. I walked back toward the cafe. The waiter from earlier gave me a confused look as I hovered nearby, trying to act normal. I sat on a stone ledge just outside, still calling, still texting, still hoping. But the minutes turned into an hour. The sun lowered in the sky. Shadows stretched long across the square. And I realized he wasn't coming back. That night I found a cheap room above a bakery, the kind of place where the stairs creak and the walls are stained with stories. The woman at the front desk didn't speak English, but she seemed to understand what I needed. She led me to a small room with a single bed and a sink in the corner. No questions asked, just a soft pat on the arm before she closed the door behind me. I stared at my phone. 27 calls to Ryan, all sent straight to voicemail. Text delivered but unread. Or worse, read and ignored. I tried Pete again, then Marco, one by one. All blocked. Sleep came in fits. I'd close my eyes and imagine the sound of tires rolling back down the street. The door opening, Ryan's face full of remorse. Then I'd jolt awake and check my phone. Still nothing. By morning, I told myself this was still a nightmare with an ending. That he'd come back, that he'd walk through the door, arms wide with a half apology, that he'd explain it all away as a joke gone too far. I was angry but still holding on to a sliver of hope. By the second day, that sliver had splintered. I had €80.37 to my name. I bought a sandwich and a bottle of water from a corner shop, rationing every bite. I wandered Granada streets looking for a familiar face, a hotel lobby, a tour guide, anyone. But they were gone. The group had moved on, continued their itinerary, probably laughing over dinner in Seville or Valencia by now. I was a detour they had no intention of revisiting. On the third day my feet ached. I hadn't changed clothes, I hadn't showered. My body felt foreign to me, like I was wearing someone else's skin. I lingered outside a cafe for too long, unsure if I was hungry or just lonely. The owner must have noticed because he handed me a free espresso and pointed down the road, miming a phone with his hand. The police station. The officer there barely spoke English. My Spanish was even worse, but he offered me a chair, listened, took down some version of my story, and typed it into his computer. When he handed me a printed copy of a report, he looked at me with quiet sympathy. I walked out with a piece of paper and a heart heavier than before. It was one thing to feel abandoned. It was another to have it confirmed by a stranger with a badge and a printer. That afternoon, I stood in front of a pawn shop. Inside, under flickering lights, a row of tarnished watches and mismatched earrings lined the display. My reflection stared back at me in the glass. Tired, puffy, hair pulled into a limp knot. I reached into my bag and ran my fingers along the band of my wedding ring. It still fit perfectly. Smooth, cold, heavy. I upgraded it for our 5th anniversary, replacing the modest little band we started with, calling it something more worthy of you. At the time I thought it was romantic. Now I realize it was just more polish on something already cracking. I stood in front of that pawn shop window for a long time. I didn't go inside. Not yet. I turned away, suddenly unsure of everything again. My chest was tight. My thoughts were loud. I walked without a destination, trying to outrun the questions crashing through my head like waves. Do I call home? Do I go back to Boston? My father would wire the money.
No hesitasten.
One call and I'd be on a plane in 48 hours. But then what? I'd have to explain. I'd have to relive it. The humiliation, the abandonment, the years I had spent shrinking myself to fit into Ryan's life, his work events, his social calendar, his comfort zone. Friends who'd seen the red flags would look at me with pity or worse, with that quiet smug, "I told you so." And what would I do in Boston anyway? Go back to being the ghost of my former self, haunted by dinners I wasn't invited to, projects I never finished, ideas I let die so Ryan could shine? Pick up where I left off in a life that never really belonged to me? No, I wasn't ready for that either. That evening I walked to the bus station. I stood in front of the electronic departure board for nearly 30 minutes, staring at names of cities I couldn't pronounce, places I'd never heard of, let alone been to. There was something oddly comforting in that. The blankness, the unknown. It was like a map of clean slates. A woman behind the ticket counter watched me, her face soft with quiet concern. "Don Vass?" she asked. I blinked. I don't know. She smiled gently and pointed to the time. I hesitated, then said, "Somewhere far." She nodded. I bought the cheapest overnight ticket heading east. No plan, no map, just a seat by the window and a bag that held everything I had left. That night on the bus I barely slept. The seats were stiff and the air smelled like tired people and old coffee, but I didn't care. I watched the highway light streak pass like stars falling sideways. My phone died somewhere around 3 a.m., but I didn't bother to charge it. There was no one I wanted to talk to. By the time the sun rose, the landscape had changed. Gone were the tight twisting alleys of Granada. Now there were hills, olive groves, low stone walls running through the earth like scars. Whitewashed houses sat in quiet clusters, clinging to the hillsides. Everything felt slower, softer, like the world here breathed differently. The bus stopped in a small town. I stepped off, legs stiff, body aching from sitting too long. My back hurt. My feet throbbed in shoes made for cafes and photo ops, not for wandering into nowhere. I had no idea where I was, but I kept walking. The streets were nearly empty, just the occasional dog sleeping in a patch of sun or a woman sweeping her doorstep. My stomach growled, hollow from 2 days of rationing crackers and coffee. The money I had left would maybe I cover one more night in a pension if I could find one cheap enough. I didn't care. I didn't want comfort, I wanted quiet. I followed a road that curved out of town, lined with trees whose leaves shimmered silver green in the wind. The air smelled of dust and olives. My water bottle was empty, but I told myself I'd be fine. I always figured it out, didn't I? That was the lie I kept repeating. I'm fine. But I wasn't fine. My legs gave out on a dirt path just outside a grove. My knees hit the ground hard, and I barely caught myself before collapsing face first into the earth. The pain didn't register, not really. It was muffled by exhaustion. Everything was. My vision blurred. My body felt far away, like I was watching myself from above. This wasn't how I pictured the end. Not glamorous, not dramatic, just quiet, forgotten. I let my eyes close. The dirt beneath my hands was warm. The breeze was soft. My thoughts drifted to strange places. Snippets of childhood songs, the smell of my mother's kitchen, the clicking sound of Ryan's keyboard when he worked late. Maybe this is fitting, I thought. Left behind in one country, collapsed in another. But then a voice, sharp and urgent, in a language I didn't understand. Hands rough, weathered, gentle, turned me over. I blinked against the sunlight. An older woman's face came into view. Deep lines etched her skin. Her eyes were wide, dark, worried. She spoke again, fast and firm, then repeated a single word I didn't know. She opened a canteen and held it to my lips. Water spilled onto my chin, but I drank. I drank until my throat didn't burn, until my mind began to piece itself back together. She said her name. Lucia, pointed to herself. Lucia, she repeated. I tried to sit up, my limbs shaky and foreign. Emily, I whispered, unsure if she'd understand. She smiled anyway, and somehow for the first time in days I felt seen. Lucia helped me to my feet with surprising strength. She was small, barely came to my shoulder, but her grip was firm, steady. My legs wobbled beneath me, and my mouth was still too dry to speak. She motioned gently, pointing uphill toward a small stone house tucked among the olive trees. I followed her. I didn't have the energy not to. The walk was slow. My feet dragged. My body screamed. But step by step we reached the house. It was simple, old but clean. Pale stone walls, a red-tiled roof, a low wooden door. Chickens wandered nearby, clucking softly. Everything smelled like earth and rosemary. Inside, the kitchen was dim and cool. Herbs hung in bunches from the wooden beams overhead. A blackened kettle hissed softly on a stove that looked older than me. Lucia sat me down at a table worn smooth by time and life. She poured water into a clay cup and set it gently in front of me. I drank slowly. Then she served me soup, something warm, simple, and deeply comforting. My stomach, empty for so long, protested at first, but the smell alone almost made me cry. A man appeared in the doorway while I ate, older, with sun-baked skin and a silver mustache. He said something in Spanish. Lucia answered, pointing to my face, my hands. He looked at me, cautious but not unkind. Javier, she said, pointing to him. He gave a small nod. I returned it. We didn't speak the same language, but something in their eyes told me I didn't need to. That night, they showed me to a spare room. The bed was narrow but clean. The sheets smelled like soap and wind. A handmade quilt lay folded at the foot. I sat on the edge, overwhelmed by exhaustion, and before I could even lie down properly, sleep pulled me under. Morning came with the sound of chickens and the smell of baking bread. At the end of the bed, folded neatly, were clean clothes, soft, worn, well-loved. They didn't fit perfectly, but they were comfortable. When I stepped into the kitchen, Lucia lit up with a smile and handed me a steaming cup of strong coffee. It was the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. We didn't talk much. My Spanish was limited to yes, no, please, thank you. But somehow we communicated, gestures, tone, looks, the way people do when they're trying and willing. At first, I tried to insist I would leave soon. I didn't want to impose. I didn't want pity. I pointed to the door, to the road, but Lucia only shook her head. She tapped my blistered feet and then the window where rain had begun to fall. Stay, she said, her accent thick but clear. One of the few English words she seemed to know, so I stayed. The first few days passed in a blur of food, sleep, and silence. My body was recovering, but slowly. I still moved like I might break. Lucia gave me space when I needed it, but always had a warm plate waiting when I emerged. Then one morning, she placed a piece of bread in my hand and motioned for me to follow her outside. We walked to a small outbuilding near the house. When she opened the door, I was hit with a familiar smell of earth and clay. A pottery wheel sat in the center of the room. Shelves lined the walls, full of bowls and vases in various stages of becoming, some raw, some drying, some already fired and painted. Lucia walked to a low table and patted it, then pointed to a mound of clay and made a spinning motion with her hand. She wanted to teach me. I didn't know why, I didn't ask, but I sat and slowly, piece by piece, I began to learn. I'd never touched a pottery wheel before. My first attempts were comical. The clay collapsed, splattered, spun off the wheel entirely once. Lucia didn't laugh. She only showed me again and again. Her hands, small but strong, moved with the ease of someone who had been doing this since childhood. There was no judgment in her gaze when I failed, only patience. It rattled something in me. I wasn't used to failing without consequence. In Boston, in my marriage, mistakes had always come with a cost: shame, silence, the slow erosion of confidence. But here, in this quiet room with muddy hands and dirt under my fingernails, failure was just part of the process. It was allowed. Lucia taught me how to knead the clay, how to center it, how to feel it. She didn't stop. Peak much, but when she did, it was gentle and purposeful. Some days we didn't use words at all. Javier began showing me how to mix glaze and how to stack the kiln. His instructions came in a mix of Spanish, miming, and smiles. I ruined a few pieces by accident. Once I dropped a finished bowl. I expected frustration, but he just shrugged and swept it up. Mañana, he said. Tomorrow. I don't know when the shift happened, when I went from guest to helper, from helper to apprentice. Maybe it was the morning I woke up before Lucia and started the coffee myself. Maybe it was when I sold my first small bowl at the market and heard a tourist say, "This is beautiful," not knowing it was mine. Maybe it was when I stopped checking my phone. Over time my body changed. My soft hands developed calluses. My arms grew stronger. I moved with a different kind of purpose now, intentional, focused. There was something deeply satisfying about creating with my own hands, about shaping something from nothing, about watching it dry in the sun and knowing I made that. At night we sat around the table. Lucia mended clothes or prepared herbs. Javier smoked his pipe and cleaned his tools. I listened to the low hum of their conversations, not understanding the words but feeling the rhythm. For the first time in a long time I felt safe, not coddled, not rescued, safe. Over time Lucia began to open up. Not through words, not fully, but through gestures and glances, the kind of slow, quiet trust that builds between people who have shared the same silence. One afternoon, while we were hanging laundry in the yard, she motioned for me to follow her inside. She climbed onto a stool, reached up to a shelf above the fireplace, and pulled down a small wooden box. She opened it with care. Inside were a few photographs, old and faded, their edges curling with time. She handed one to me. A young woman with Lucia's eyes and Javier's smile, standing barefoot in front of the same pottery workshop I now spent my days in. "Sophia," Lucia said softly, tapping the photo. Her voice changed when she said the name, softer, fragile. She pointed far away into the distance, then mimed an airplane with her hand. "Australia." Then she made a cradling motion with her arms. "A baby." She pointed to another photo, newer, of a child I didn't recognize. Then held up her hand, palm out, and slowly moved it away from her heart. "No," she said. The grief was there in her eyes, deep, quiet, and decades old. And in that moment I understood I wasn't just someone she was helping. I was someone who filled a space that had been empty for a very long time. She didn't say the words, but she didn't need to. To her, I was a presence in the kitchen again. A shadow at the wheel. A voice in the mornings. I didn't feel like I was being used to replace someone. I felt needed, not in a way that demanded anything from me, but in a way that simply made room for me. That realization broke something loose in me. For so long I had been needed only for appearances, for keeping things smooth, for standing beside. A man who wanted a supportive wife, not an equal partner. I had become background noise in my own life. But here Lucia and Javier looked at me with eyes that said, "You belong here if you want to," and I wanted to. 3 months after I arrived, the rhythms of the house had begun to feel like my own. I knew when the hens liked to be fed, how to stack firewood so it didn't collapse, and how to smooth the clay before it cracked. One afternoon Lucia and I sat by the window shelling peas. She looked at me for a long time, then said simply, "You stay." I paused. She pointed toward the workshop, then to herself, then to me. "You stay, work, learn together." Javier nodded from the corner where he was polishing a finished piece. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were warm. I didn't know what to say, but I nodded. Lucia smiled, then reached into a woven basket beside her and pulled out a small envelope. She handed it to me without ceremony. Inside were a few folded euro notes. "For you," she said. "First money." It wasn't much, but it was the first time in years that I had been paid for something real, something I had created with my own hands. No favors, no strings, no pretending. It was mine. A small envelope, yes, but it felt like everything. And in that quiet kitchen, sunlight warming the floor, I realized I had found something here that I never thought I would again. A family, a purpose, a life I got to choose. It had been 6 months since Ryan left me in Granada, 6 months since I stood on a street with no money, no plan, no one to call. And now he was here. I was helping Javier stack finished pieces outside the workshop when I heard the sound of a car pulling up the dirt road. I looked up and saw him, Ryan, stepping out of a rental car like he had just arrived for a vacation. Not to face what he did. Lucia came to the door. She didn't say anything, but I knew she felt it too. The shift in the air, the way my hands had stopped moving. I wiped my palms on my apron and walked out to meet him. He looked me over from head to toe like he was trying to figure out what changed. I knew what he saw. Sun-browned skin, loose braid, old work clothes, no makeup, calloused hands. I didn't look like the woman he left behind. "Emily," he said, like the name still belonged to him. "You look different." I stayed quiet. He stepped closer. "I've been looking for you. I had to hire someone. It took months, but I'm here now. I've come to take you home." I let out a breath and shook my head, already feeling the heat rise in my chest. "You left me, Ryan. You drove off. You blocked my number. You didn't come back. Not that day, not the next, not ever." He frowned. "I made a mistake. I know that now. We were both angry." "No," I cut in. "You weren't angry. You were cruel. You left me alone in a country where I didn't speak the language. No money, no cards. You had my ID, my wallet, everything. I was terrified." My voice cracked, and before I could stop it, the tears came. I didn't want them to, but they did. I kept talking anyway. I walked around for hours trying to find help. I didn't know. Where was I? I didn't even know how to ask for food. I had to sleep in a room above a bakery that smelled like mildew. I cried into a pillow waiting for you to come back. Lucia came up beside me and gently placed a hand on my back. Javier stood a few steps behind, watching but not interfering. "I had to sell my wedding ring to eat," I said, turning back to Ryan. "Do you understand that I pawned the only thing I had left just to survive? And then when I collapsed from hunger, Lucia found me, a stranger." He looked uncomfortable now, glancing between us. She didn't know who I was, and she helped me anyway. They both did. They gave me a bed, a place to rest. And then little by little, they gave me a life. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Look, Emily, I know I messed up. But you've made your point. You've disappeared long enough. Let's just go back and fix this." "No," I said, and I meant it. "I don't want to fix anything. Not with you." I went inside, grabbed the folder I had prepared weeks ago just in case, and handed it to him. Inside were the partnership papers for the workshop and the divorce. He flipped through them, stunned. "You're serious," he said. "Yes," I replied. "I found something here. Something I built myself. I belong here. I'm not yours anymore." Lucia reached for my hand and held it gently. I didn't need to explain myself. Not to her, not to him. "You left me, Ryan," I said one last time, "and I found my way forward without you." Ryan stared at the divorce papers like they were in a language he didn't understand. His face changed. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something close to panic. He looked up at me, eyes wide. "You're serious?" he asked. I didn't answer. He flipped through the pages again, his hands moving faster now, like if he read them quickly enough they'd disappear. "You already signed this?" I nodded. "Weeks ago." He blinked. "Why would you do this without talking to me first?" "You talked to me when you left me in the street in Spain," I said. "You made that decision without a word, so I made mine." His jaw clenched. He laughed under his breath, short, sharp, bitter. "This is insane. You don't even belong here." "I do now," I said. "I built something here. Something you never let me have." He looked past me toward the workshop. then at Lucia and Javier standing silently nearby. His voice dropped, quieter now, like he was trying to reel me back. We had a life, Emily. A nice one. Are you really throwing all that away for this? I looked him in the eye. You threw it away the moment you left me behind like garbage. And this, I gestured to the workshop, to my hands, to myself. This is a life. I didn't throw anything away. I started over. His face twisted. I could see it. He didn't know what to say because for the first time he wasn't in control. You're going to regret this, he said, trying to sound firm, but his voice cracked halfway through. I smiled, not out of cruelty but out of truth. No, Ryan, I said. I already regretted wasting 10 years trying to be small enough to fit into your life. This is peace. His mouth opened again, but nothing came out. His hands were still clutching the folder like he didn't know what to do with it. Like it was proof that he had lost something he never thought could walk away from him. I watched as that hit him, really hit him. He wasn't the one leaving this time. He was the one being left behind. Lucia came to stand beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. Javier was still like stone but solid. Ryan looked at them, looked at me, and then he turned away. He didn't say goodbye. He just got in the car, slammed the door harder than he needed to, and drove off, kicking up dust behind him. I quickly returned to the work I had poured my heart into. Feeling a sense of relief, I focused on the feel of it, the weight, the resistance, the quiet strength in my fingers. My hands, once shaky from fear and hunger, were now steady and sure, strong from work, from building something real. I shaped the clay into something smooth, something whole. This right here was the life I had made. No one handed it to me. No one planned it for me. I created it from nothing, with nothing, in the middle of nowhere. Ryan thought he was teaching me a lesson when he left me alone. He was, but it wasn't the one he intended. He thought I'd fall apart, that I'd crawl back, that I'd realize I needed him. But I didn't fall apart. I found myself. And in doing that, I found freedom. Not the loud kind. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes from knowing you don't need anyone's permission to be whole. The wheel kept spinning, the clay took shape, and I kept going.